Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a nutcracker. This one is actually quite simple to paint. It's basically just coloring it in, so let's begin by sketching it out. Because the shape of the nutcracker is quite symmetrical, I'm going to roll out the center of my page, and this way I can use it as guideline so I know how to center the nutcracker right in the middle of the space that I have. For this painting, I already had a vision of how I would like to approach the composition. I wanted this painting to have a bright background, so I also indicated the border of where the paint or the color would end. This way I can draw the correct size to fit more or less within the border. Before I start drawing out the details, I very loosely just sketch out the main parts of the nutcracker for the body. I just tried to get the proportions down, and mind you, I already did a rough sketch in a separate sketchbook, so I also had an idea of how I wanted to divide up the body from the clothing and things like that. After getting the torso and the legs, I then added the arms. As you can see, I included the clothing straight away because I already had an image in mind, but if you would like to customize the clothing, you can also sketch out your ideas beforehand so you don't have to guess and erase too much. As for the pose, I wanted my nutcracker to have a staff as a prop. This way the pose isn't too flat and boring, and I just find that the prop also adds to the character. Personally, I want my nutcracker to have a cute style, so I'm going to round up the angles that I drew and make the face really rounded and cute. However, the angles are actually quite important because it's much easier for us to visualize the lines and the angled lines to help with the accuracy. This is why I approached it this way. Those angled lines basically just served as guidelines before I add the cleaner curved lines. Once I'm happy with the proportions, then it's time to do the fun part, which is to add the characteristics of the nutcracker, like the details of the clothing, face, hair, and so on. If you're sketching this out and you're still unhappy with the proportions, I would suggest for you to figure it out and clean out the lines before adding on these details, because you'll end up erasing too much of the details to correct the proportions, and it actually takes away the fun because you feel like you've wasted time and effort drawing out all the beautiful details. So please keep this in mind if you're sketching your own. However, for those of you who would like to get straight to painting, I'll of course have the outline available in my coffee shop. One last thing for the sketch, I'm just going to use a ruler to draw the line for the staff because it's really thin and it's really hard to not make it crooked. And after I'm done with all the details, I want to clean the lines as best as I can. I try to erase any messy lines slightly and draw cleaner, less scratchy lines, but generally I want my outline to still be lightly drawn so there are no scratchiness showing through as I paint later. This also includes my guideline that runs through the middle of the sketch. One final thing, because the nutcracker is very vertical in terms of composition, I also added some decorative leaves to fill in the larger spaces, but you can also add different background items as well if you have any other ideas. I'm just going to add a few stars as well, and next I'm going to go over the colors. I have Prussian Blue by Holbein, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Crimson Lake by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, and Bleed Proof White by Dr. Paige Martins. As for the details and outline, I'm going to be using my colored pencils as well. And this is just a very cheap one by Faber Castell, and it's just a hobby grade. They don't have specific names for the colors, instead they have numbers. So in case you have the exact same brand, here are the numbers, but you can basically use any brand you have on hand. Since I want the background to be a very flat color, I'm going to be using gouache, and here I'm using my HIMI gouache. The colors are acid blue, black, and white. Let's get straight to painting. The first thing I'm going to paint is the face, or basically the skin tone. I'm going to use a mix of titanium gold ochre with a little bit of vermilion and also yellow ochre. I'm looking for a soft, creamy but peachy color, and I'm just going to use a light to medium consistency to cover the face as smooth as I can. As I'm painting the face, I want to try to avoid painting on the eyebrows, the teeth, as well as the mustache. While the surface is still damp, I'm going to add a bit of vermilion to the previous skin tone, and this is just for the nose as well as the blush for the cheeks. I'm also going to paint the hands using the same color as the face. Moving on to the details of the hat, I'm going to use a mix of yellow ochre and burnt umber to create a golden color, and I'm just going to paint it flatly again. There's also a similar pattern for his clothing on his shoulders, so I'm going to use the same color. By the way, I'm using a fairly large brush for this because, as you guys know, if you've been here for a while, this paper is damaged and I'm trying to cover the space as quickly as possible, so the large brush gives me a slightly heavier load. However, if you're painting at the same size, I would go down one brush size to make it a bit easier to control your paint flow. I'm going to put him in a traditional Nutcracker uniform, and the majority of the color is going to be red, but since I don't want the red to be glaring, I use a mix of vermilion with a little bit of burnt umber to mute the red slightly. This is going to be one of the main colors for the uniform, so just like before, I'm going to paint it flatly and I'm using a medium consistency. For the top of the hat, I'm going to use a darker red to separate the face of the structure. And instead of just adding more burnt umber in the ratio, I decided to make the color richer by also mixing in some crimson lake. For the shoulder, you can see a line dividing the oval, and this is because I was kind of imagining the wood cut into two pieces, so I'm trying to make it separate, but this is not a must. You can also just color it with one color. But as for me, because I made that division, I painted one side using the darker red and the back using the lighter red. As for the front face of the shoulders, I'm just going to use the same lighter red from vermilion and burnt umber. Since I'm trying to avoid the smaller areas, it's much easier for me to outline those tinier areas that I'm trying to avoid first before painting the rest of the space. So you can use this trick whenever you're trying to paint around an object. I'm also going to introduce a different accent color, and it's going to be a muted blue. I used Prussian blue with a little bit of crimson lake, and I also added a touch of burnt umber. And those are basically the colors that I'm going to keep using to paint the rest of the clothing, just those 3 or 4 if you want to count the dark red and the lighter red as separate colors. So basically the muted red, the golden color from yellow ochre and burnt umber, and also this muted blue. So I'm just going to keep coloring the rest of the clothes. This is why I mentioned that this painting is quite simple. Maybe the drawing is a little bit tricky, but once you have the outline, It was just really enjoyable to color it in. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy watching the rest of the uniform being painted, and I'll get back to you when I'm ready to move on to the next steps. Let me just cut a little bit here for the base color of the star. I'm using a different color. This is mostly Hansa Yellow Medium with only a little bit of vermilion mixed into it to turn it into a deeper yellow. As for the rest of the staff, I'm going to use the same color combination, but for the rod itself, I ended up using the same blue color, but just in a thinner consistency, so it turns more grayish. Next, I'm going to add a bit of dimension to the star, and for this, I used Hansa Yellow mixed with the light muted red color. And here I'm just going to try to divide each star point into two halves and basically paint one side. Generally, I would just pick the same side all over, but I made a mistake, but it kind of worked out still in the end. Moving on to the decorative elements, I basically just added Hansa Yellow to the blue mixture that I already had on my palette. I added quite a bit of Hansa Yellow in order to get a slightly lighter green because the blue was quite dark. And I'm just going to use the same color for the rest of the leaves. As for the leaves of the holly, I wanted this to be a little bit darker or richer and more vibrant in the green. So I added more Prussian blue and Hansa Yellow so it becomes less muted. As for the berries, I mixed Crimson Lake with Vermilion as the base color, and I also left out a bit of white space for the highlights. Since I've painted all of the elements, now I'm going to move on to the background. Here you can see me mixing my gouache. I used a lot of white, a little bit of acid blue, and also a touch of black to mute the blue very slightly. Since my gouache is quite dry, I added a lot of water, so everything is well incorporated into each other. As for the application, I'm first using this Filbert brush in order to cover the larger spaces. Then I'm going to switch to my round brush for the edges. When you're painting the background, there are a lot of awkward spaces, so feel free to rotate your sketchbook or your paper around in order to get the correct angle for your hands to move around. Now that I've covered the larger spaces, I'm going to switch to my previous round brush, and this is just much easier to get to the corners. The background might look really patchy here, but that's because wet gouache dries in a slightly darker tone, so the wet gouache will apply much lighter. This is why I find gouache quite difficult to work with, especially when I'm painting a flat surface, so make sure you mixed in enough paint so you don't have to keep remixing the same color. After this, since the stars are a little bit unclean, I'm just going to extend the vertical and horizontal lines with a bit of bleed-proof white. Then I just colored the star in using a really light consistency of the yellows that I already had on my palette. I also used the bleed-proof white to add the midribs as well as the stem for the leaves to connect them all together. And lastly, I'm going to add the line details using the pencils. So here I'm using a light red, similar to vermilion in terms of tone, and I used it to enhance the blush of the nose and the cheeks. Then I'm using my darkest color here, which is similar to a sepia, to line the face as well as the details of the face. For the outline of the clothes, I decided to use a reddish brown color here, and I'm also going to use this color to add some shading, and this will just enhance the three-dimensional form because at the moment it's looking quite flat. You don't actually have to add the shadows using pencil. You can actually paint it on if you would like, depending on the style that you're looking for. But for me, I like the pencil scratches or the texture it makes. I just find that it makes it look a bit more childlike and whimsical, which is why I've decided to approach it this way. For a softer shade, I tend to put more pressure and make the scratches closer together around the edges. Then as I get closer to the middle, I use less pressure and I also add a bit more distance between my scratches. But because the base color and the reddish brown is quite different in value, it's quite hard to smooth it out. So after using the darker reddish brown, I followed it up using the vermilion colored pencil, and I find that this just gives a smoother transition. If the texture is a bit too strong for certain areas, I actually just use a damp brush to soften the pencil marks. This won't get rid of the texture completely, but I just find that it smooths it out a little bit since this is also watercolor colored pencils. And lastly, for the extra outline, I ended up using the sepia color again because I find that this just makes the whole painting pop a little bit more. For the finishing touch, I'd like to add a bit of shine to the Nutcracker. So I'm using bleed-proof white in a medium to thin consistency to add some highlights around rounded areas. And for the pants, I also added lines for detailing as well. If some of the edges, or after you've applied the bleed-proof white, it looks a bit too opaque, I like to soften it using a clean damp brush, and this will also take the excess paint off. I'm also going to add highlights to the rod or the staff to make it look a bit shiny. Lastly, after looking at the painting as a whole, I found that the color of the face and hands faded too much, and it's also looking flat compared to the other elements after I've added the shading. But since I don't have the right colors to shade the skin tone, I just used watercolor instead. I basically used the same mixture for the skin tone with added burnt umber to darken some of the edges to enhance the form. And that's basically it for this painting. If you guys enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. Like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!